Well, I'm pretty primed just from the wedding on the weekend, and had a wedding last weekend and a wedding this weekend. So I'm exhausted. Mine gets a little tired, and a long drive home then last night. So when you get a little tired, it gets a little dangerous. Always a little dangerous because the filter is not quite as sharp. So I'll warn you that already. But we'll see how things go as we continue. Then in 1 Samuel, I love it that God uses the ordinary just to reveal himself as an extraordinary God. And he delights in just using ordinary people, which to me, in his doing of that, just magnifies his greatness. And so today we're going to continue our journey through 1 and 2 Samuel, our summer series, which we're calling The Shepherd King. And to get us up to speed, we'll review here a little bit, first of all, and just where we've been. We started looking at seeing how the people of Israel, they wanted a king, and which at its heart, we learned was a rejection of God. Not kind of an outright rejection where they say, God, we don't want anything to do with you, but rather, God, I don't trust you. You're not enough. I want a king who we can actually control, who provide for all my needs and wants as I determine, and ideally in my timing as well. And so they choose a man whose name is Saul, and he looked great by all outward appearances. And in fact, he started out pretty good, but he turned out to be a king like most kings. The power corrupted his heart, and he became proud and self-willed, and he ended up using his position of power to serve himself rather than to serve the people that he was called to lead. And so the result was really Saul was using and abusing people, and he would bend the laws of God, and he would justify what he did whenever it served him, when it served his purposes. And so at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 15, Samuel the prophet is in deep distress because of the sin of Saul, and Saul turned out to be not anything like he had hoped. And that's because Samuel had had this vision that was given to him by his mother Hannah back in chapter 2 of a king whose heart would actually align with God's heart. A king who would love and trust God and would teach the people to do the same. A king who would use his power to actually bless and serve the people, to promote justice and lift up the needy. The kind of king that you wouldn't have to command the allegiance of the people because he'd win it from them. And the people would be willing to die for him because they could see he was willing to die for them. But Saul, he turned out to be faithful to nobody but himself, and he was pretty quick to throw pretty much everybody under the bus to justify his own self-absorbed actions. And so Samuel, he's feeling kind of depressed like if you're about to get married and then suddenly you found the person you were marrying is a total fraud. Because Samuel had these high hopes, though he knew it was sin for Israel to even ask for a king at this time. Yet he knew God was a redeeming God, and God was full of mercy. And so his desire was that Saul and the people would humble themselves and actually trust God and begin to do his revealed will. But what we've seen is Saul's moving just into continued disobedience towards God's clear commands with no real repentance. And so God then revealed to Samuel his utter rejection of Saul as king. And thus Samuel's hopes were shattered. So we're going to continue the saga beginning in 1 Samuel chapter 16, beginning at verse 1. We will have the scripture verse on the screen as well. If you don't have a Bible, I guess they're over on this table over here. If you don't have a Bible, there's a few yet on the table. You can grab one and use the table of contents at the beginning to help you find the book of 1 Samuel, which is in what we call the Old Testament scriptures, the time before Jesus. And if you don't own a Bible, just take one of those Bibles home with you. It's our gift to you, and you can read the entire section and story. So 1 Samuel 16, verse 1. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I've rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse, the Bethlehemite, for I've provided for myself a king among his sons." And Samuel said, "Well, how can I go? If Saul hears about it, he'll kill me." Because that's going to be politically treasonous. Think about it. To anoint a new king while the old king is still on the throne. right? You can well imagine how that's going to go. And so the Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. So God suggests to Samuel, organize this big civic event, an area-wide sacrifice. And that way, if he's ever asked for a reason that he's gone there by Saul, then he'd just not mention that he went there to select a new king to replace Saul. It would just be on a need-to-know basis with information that he would pass on. And so verse 3, he tells Samuel then, and invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do, and you shall anoint for me him whom I declare to you. Now Jesse, he's the grandson of Boaz and Ruth the Moabite. And for those who are familiar then with the book of Ruth in the Old Testament scriptures, you will know and probably love those two characters. If you don't know who Boaz and Ruth are, we did a whole series a couple of years ago through the book of Ruth, and you can find that online at graceas.com in the sermon archives. And there's a filter there where you can select and search by books of the Bible, and you can search through Ruth, and you can get the story of Boaz and Ruth. It's a pretty amazing section, a small little book of scripture. So continuing in verse 4, Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him trembling and said, "Did you come peaceably?" Because you got to understand, prophets weren't the most popular people because they came delivering messages from God, often pointing out your wrong, bringing news of impending judgment. In other words, if your wife saw a prophet coming up the walk to your house, she'd turn to you and say, "Okay, what have you done now?" So the elders of Bethlehem are not real excited to see Samuel come to their village. And so they're asking him, are you here peaceably or are you here to kick somebody's butt? What's going on? See, back then they didn't have Chuck Norris jokes. They had Samuel the prophet jokes. Samuel didn't wet his bed as a child. The bed wet itself out of fear. Right? Samuel and Superman once fought each other on a bet, and the loser had to start wearing his underwear on the outside of his pants. And Samuel had a grizzly bear rug in his room. The bear isn't dead. It's just afraid to move. But needless to say, Samuel didn't get invited to too many parties. In fact, the last one he was there at was in chapter 13, where we saw that he basically called out a storm and it rained on the whole harvest crop. Right? And then he gave them a verbal rebuke for their sin, their evil, right? Reminding them of their selection of a king on their terms. And so, verse 5, and so he, that's Samuel, said in reply to that, "No, peaceably, I'm here peaceably this time." He says, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. And he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. So Bethlehem, being the small town that it is, I imagine that the word spreads through the crowd quickly that there's going to be a sacrifice, but this is going to be more than a sacrifice. A new king was being chosen. So everyone would be consecrating themselves for this feast and trying to look kingly until Samuel consecrates Jesse and his sons to be the kingly pool. So Samuel, I imagine, would head to Jesse's house, and Jesse opens the door, and Samuel would say, "God told me that one of your sons is supposed to be king." So Jesse, he thinks, I know exactly which one of my sons that would be, Eliab, and he brings him out. So out comes Eliab. He's the oldest. He's good-looking, tall. He's got this commanding presence about him. And even Samuel is pretty quick to jump on the Eliab bandwagon, right, before knowing anything about his character at all. And so verse 6, when they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed's before him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." So much like our own culture, the world is focused particularly on a person's outward appearance. And our celebrity and porn culture really trains you to look at people the exact opposite way that God does. Because God doesn't look or judge people the way we do. What does he look at? He looks at the heart, right? Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, in one sense, we're glad that we don't have to impress by our appearance. But who has the heart that God wants? And do you spend as much time focusing on your heart as you do your outward appearance? I mean, what about this morning, right? Before you came here. Because if you spent more time focused on your appearance than your heart, then whose opinion are you actually more concerned about? People's or God's? It's just a question. Just a question. Now, Samuel, of all people, should have known that God is concerned with the heart. Because think of Saul, right? I mean, he had all the impressive credentials. So is Samuel really going to make that same mistake again? Because Eliab, he looks impressive. But we're going to find out in the very next chapter that Eliab is critical, he is arrogant, he is fearful, and he doesn't trust God. So verse 8. Then Jesse goes on to the next son. So he called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. You see, because King Abinadab, almost like King Aluminum, right? It just doesn't really flow off the tongue easily. So he's got to move on. Verse 9, that Jesse made Shammah pass by. And he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord's not chosen these. Don't you get a picture of Cinderella? Right? And just none of them can jam their foot in the glass slipper, right? They keep coming. Verse 11, then Samuel said to Jesse, are all your sons here? Jesse starts counting on his fingers. Oh yeah, there's one more, And so there's another one. And he said, there remains yet the youngest. But behold, he's keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, well, send him and get him, for we won't sit down until he comes here. Now, the Hebrew word translated youngest, according to my commentaries, is a word that means the runt. Go, oh yeah, there's the runt of the litter, right? And he's keeping the sheep. It's always tough being the youngest, right? Who here is the youngest? There's a few of you. We know you because you got the hand-me-down clothes. Yeah. But see, everyone celebrates the firstborns, right? Their first words, right? They're the ones with all the pictures. They celebrate their first steps. But by the time you get down to number 8, you'll eventually get to it, right? And so you're kind of taken for granted, right? If you're the youngest, you're always looked at as the baby of the family. So there's David, the baby of the family, the runt, and he is keeping the sheep. But you see, it's slaves and rejects that kept the sheep. In fact, wealthy families, they would get a servant to keep the sheep, but it truly was unskilled labor. And so what we see here, that not even his own father considers David. Not even his own father. So in verse 11, Samuel, he's kind of ticked off that Jesse couldn't understand what all his sons meant. So he says, no one is going to eat. No one here is even going to sit down. We're just going to stand here and we're going to wait. You can see why prophets weren't usually invited to the parties, right? But finally, the hungriest guy, he tears off across the field to find David. Verse 12, and he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. Now ruddy, a word you may not typically use, it means reddish. So maybe it's due to his complexion being outside in the sun, or else it could mean freckled. But he had beautiful eyes. So he doesn't look like a man of war, in other words. He doesn't look like this kingly king that they would expect. So though God focuses not on the outward appearance, he focuses on the heart. It's not sin to be good looking, thankfully. You know. Now, I don't know. Told you, no filter today. I don't know if it was Samuel's wife who actually had him add this into the text, Mention his eyes. You didn't mention his eyes, And he's handsome, I don't know, but it's, he says in one hand, right? And not focused on the outward appearance, but looks at the heart. But yeah, There's the outward appearance as well. Verse 13, then he continues, then Samuel took the horn of oil, anointed him, so anoints this the runt David, in the midst of his brothers, the shepherd. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. See, I think the point is that David was in himself just ordinary. But the Spirit of the Lord came upon him and actually stayed upon him. And that's how this ordinary guy ends up with this incredible, extraordinary life. I mean, you know that David and Goliath thing? Because that just happened just in the regular run-of-the-mill days of life. He was just bringing lunch to his brothers. And those amazing Psalms, I mean, some are written just while hanging out long hours in the pasture. Some were written when he was on the run and hiding out in caves from King Saul, who wanted his life. But we learn that David's strength, who David was, did not come from just his own personal inward awesomeness. See, the world tells you you've got to become extraordinary. You've got to step out to be extraordinary. But there is nothing extraordinary about David. But the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him and continued with him. See, David had the access to the power of an extraordinary God because he didn't think he was extraordinary in himself, like Saul did. See, he didn't think of himself as someone special. He was not this unique snowflake, right? I'm not special. David was not special. In 2 Samuel 7, after years of blessing as a king, David still just humbly wondered and said, Lord, who am I that you've brought me thus far? And here it is. This is just all because of grace, your grace. James in chapter 5, verse 17, in his New Testament book, he tells us Elijah was considered the greatest prophet. He just says he was just an ordinary guy with a nature like ours. So Christians are not extraordinary people. We are ordinary people with an extraordinary God. We're just a bunch of nobodies telling everybody about a great somebody. And then, secondly, the world associates you and your value often with your work. And that's why one of the first questions you're often asked, I mean, sometimes it's just because it's trying to strike up conversation, but often you're asked when you meet someone new is what do you do? Right? So I'm a teacher, I'm a lawyer. Well, David was a shepherd. That's the lowest job in society. And so the world would say he's nothing. Oh, then you're insignificant. You're nothing. You're a shepherd. A third lie often believed is that God needs you, that he needs your talents. You know, if only that famous person would get saved, then wow, that would advance the kingdom. But that's not true, because no one's needed by God. We're just not that special. The fourth lie, and this one's a big one, is that you need to chase your dreams to be fulfilled. I don't know if you've heard that. I don't know if you've thought it. But Jesus didn't dream of going to the cross. Paul didn't achieve his dream being shipwrecked 3 times and beaten and dying in a prison. But they did those things because it was right. And God called them to that, and that's what the world needed. And so it was because David knew he was just ordinary, and he was a recipient of undeserved grace, that God then would do extraordinary things through David. Because his extraordinary life was the Spirit of God working in and through David for the glory of God. And that's true throughout the Bible. I mean, this was the power of the early church, the Spirit in them. So let's embrace our ordinariness. Is that a word? Ordinariness. Ordinariness. Because it's only as we cease trying to be Saul that God can be extraordinary through you. Because God works through those who are weak in themselves, but strong in our confidence in God. Because the world doesn't need more Sauls. It needs God. And after the Spirit of God rushes on David, you know where David goes? Right? Here he is. He's anointed by Samuel, the recognized prophet in the nation. Right? He's anointed to be the king of Israel. What a moment. But he doesn't get his picture on People magazine. He's not being interviewed on The Tonight Show. No, he goes back to the pasture to look after the sheep. That's where he goes for the next 15 years. And how do we know this? Well, you'll know this from as we continue to read the passage. And later, in fact, when Saul is tormented spiritually and mentally, he sends for someone to get David to come and actually play music to soothe him. And where do they go to find David? They got to get him out of the pasture because that's where he is. Verse 19, you can see it there in this chapter. Therefore, Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me David, your son, who's with the sheep." That's where he is. Here he is, the God-appointed, God-anointed king of Israel, and he's just faithfully watching the sheep. He's not promoting himself on his own podcast. He's not buying up david.com for his website domain. And then when God starts clearly showing he's got his hand on David, and Saul is jealous and starts to hunt him down. I mean, he's God's anointed king, but seemingly he's like put on the shelf. And things are now going from bad to worse. So you start going, well, is there some mistake, right? No, you see, God uses the pasture to prepare his king. Because God's about building character and faith in his leaders. And it's in the pasture where David just works in obscurity, just serving without fanfare, without recognition, just faithfully serving. Doing the same thing Tuesday that he did on Monday. Doing the same thing Wednesday that he did on Monday and Tuesday. And so he worked in monotony. What'd you do today, David? What'd you accomplish? Well, same as yesterday. I watched the sheep. I watched the sheep. I was in the pasture, right? Well, I practiced a little slingshot too. That might come in handy later, right? And I played some of my lyre. I don't know how you hold a lyre. I don't know. But I was working on a couple new songs. Want to hear them? It's okay, David. It's okay. Oh, he did kill a lion and a bear, but nobody was there to witness it. Nobody sought to verify it. David endured suffering. He was driven from his home. He was pursued by a jealous Saul, even though he hadn't done anything wrong, especially against Saul. But it's in the pasture where God developed David's character, his skill with a slingshot, his musical abilities, his courage as he faced wild beasts attacking the sheep. And there he learned humility. There he learned patience as God taught him to wait and to trust. Wait and trust. In Psalm 78, the psalmist there, writing of David in verse 70, he says, "He," that's the Lord, "chose David his servant and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the nursing ewes, he brought him to shepherd Jacob his people, Israel his inheritance. With upright heart, he shepherded them." You can see he was developing the heart of a shepherd in this shepherd and guided them with his skillful hand. That's where he learned in the pasture the things that he needed in his character. So the good shepherd shepherded his chosen shepherd in the pasture. That's where his character, his skill all came from, in the pasture, in this behind-the-scenes faithfulness. And God still trains his warriors this way. Mom, what did you do yesterday? Change diapers? Clean up the kitchen only to know it's going to be a disaster again in a few hours, and you're just going to put that on repeat? Rinse and repeat? And how much recognition and appreciation did you get for that? Did your husband and your children all rise up and call you blessed? But who knows what God is setting up for you and your kids, even maybe years from now. And teacher, what'd you do last week? Tried to teach them long division. Yeah, they didn't pick that up. But of course, there's that one kid that tried to flush his textbook down the toilet. That's always exciting. Not. And student, what'd you do? Oh, you had to memorize all those formulas that you're never going to use in real life. Laborer, working your menial dead-end job. What might God do with your faithfulness? You're working that job as unto the Lord. So what mundane, ordinary things are you doing where God's developing your character, your patience, your humility, your honesty, your integrity? See, God's not just at work when you're at an event, when you're gathered in church, when you go on a mission trip, or when you're in a prayer meeting, but He's always working. And even in the mundane and in the ordinary, and perhaps maybe even especially in the mundane and ordinary. You know, when we look at appointing someone at Grace Fellowship to be a shepherd, to be a pastor, an under shepherd underneath our chief pastor, Jesus, and we just want to look and get to know them. We want to see if they're just willing to just come in and humbly serve. Just to use their gifts, to use their position to serve in areas maybe they're not even gifted in, without any promise of ever being in a role of a pastor, without any promise of ever being paid. So when considering elders, we just look for those who have a humble servant heart. Because to us, character means more than gifting. And character is doing the right thing, whether it makes you happy or not. So God often calls us to be faithful in what's small before He trusts us with the true riches. Jesus said that. So don't waste your pasture time. And don't waste your suffering, because these are actually God's discipling tools for actually forming in you the heart that He wants. See, David, he's called a man after God's own heart. He was formed, though, by the Spirit in the times of solitude with God and prayer and life in the pasture. Another insight to consider from this passage is to remember that our eyesight, and our insight really is limited. Because we usually only see things from typically one perspective. And as we saw with the eldest son, Eliab, a worldly view actually caused Samuel and even Jesse, his own father, to draw wrong conclusions. And why? Because as we read back in verse 7, man looks at the outward appearance. In other words, the eyes of man are not only limited, but we're prone to misjudgment. We're prone to that, and we should remember that. In fact, many of you even look at yourself that way. I mean, you look at yourself in the mirror, and what you see is what the world sees. Instead, we should see yourselves as one who's loved by God. See, David, his name means beloved. And if you're chosen by God and anointed by the Spirit, you're beloved. So what matters is not what this person or what this other person might think of me, but we need to ask, well, what does God think of me? Who does God say that I am? But we don't want to simply read this story too as if it's all about you. Because all of this is actually pointing to a much greater story. As we consider David, the young boy from Bethlehem, there was another child of Bethlehem who was not allowed in, but he too was kept out with the sheep and the animals. There was another son, and he wasn't just forgotten by his father. He was forsaken by his father, where he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" See, David, he looked ordinary. He's chosen, he's anointed, and then the Spirit of God rushes upon him, and then he goes back to the pasture, spends the next 15 years of his life in obscurity and suffering. But there was another dismissed shepherd who came into this world. He looked very ordinary, the son of a carpenter, and he spent the first 30 years of his life mostly in obscurity, just living an ordinary life as a Jewish boy. And then he was anointed at his baptism. at age 30. And the Spirit of God came upon him like a dove. And then what? Where'd he go? He was driven into the pasture, driven into the wilderness, right? Not just to be hunted down by Saul, but where he was going to be assaulted by Satan for 40 days. And he was not just instantly anointed and ushered to his throne, but Satan actually came to him at that time and offered him the throne in a way that would shortcut the pasture, in a way that would shortcut the suffering. But Jesus just said, no, devil. This is not about my personal kingdom of self. This is about my Father's will. And my calling first is to suffer and to die. So Jesus' time on earth wouldn't be spent in power, in privilege, but in obscurity and in suffering and ultimately death, the death on a cross. And God would use his life of suffering and the cross to save the world. So the point of the story is not for you to press on patiently and God will put you on the throne, because that seat's already taken. The point is that Jesus is on the throne. And we're called to extend the kingdom the same way he did, as ordinary people, living ordinary lives, but with a Spirit-empowered gospel intentionality, where we take up our cross daily, so that through patience in suffering and through faithfulness in small, ordinary things, God builds the kingdom of Jesus. And in Jesus' kingdom, the way up is down. So it's in the pasture. In the pastures where you learn servanthood and humility and obedience and patience and trust. See, God saw the true king. And he said, Samuel, stop your weeping, because I see the true king. Do you see the true king? It's Jesus. Do you embrace him? Because Jesus is the current God-anointed king. Now, I know Satan's still running around wearing a crown, and he still wears robes of light so that can cover and mask his intentions. But the kingdom has been torn from him. Jesus is the rightful king. He's a man after God's own heart. Many don't see the greatness of the shepherd king. Many are impressed by him because he just seems like he's just this ordinary human. But to those who do see the heart of this historical Jewish man crucified on a Roman cross, we bow our hearts to him. Because he is risen and his throne is established forever. So let's proclaim the good news of a king who condescended to sit and to eat with sinners and tax collectors, who welcomes the outcasts and offers forgiveness. In the Garden of Eden, humanity fell when it actually looked upon the forbidden fruit and, seeing as man sees, declared it was pleasing to the eyes and ate and said that was good. And we follow in their same steps, right? We look at that which is evil and we call it good. And when we looked at Jesus, his reign was not pleasing to our eye, so we said, no, we will not have this man reign over us. And when he stepped off his throne of glory, we gave him a crown of thorns. We cursed him. And we stripped off his robe to expose his flesh, to dishonor him, to mock his nakedness, considering him this powerless peasant. But he didn't look at us like we looked at him. He looked at us with love and compassion. He saw us like sheep without a shepherd. And so with all authority in heaven and earth, he, the ultimate king, he took the form of a servant. He took the lowest place, a shepherd, to live for us, a shepherd to die for us, a shepherd king who would rise from death in victory for us. Because you see, God not only looks at the heart, but he sees according to his own heart. Which means it's not about the place that God has in the heart of David as much as the place that David has in the heart of God. God pursued David and filled him with the Spirit and sustained and strengthened him. And the same is true of us. It's God who has loved us first. God looks at us and he sees us with his heart, a redeeming heart of mercy and grace and love. And he's anointed us with his Spirit so that he might transform our heart in the pasture. In the pasture. You know, if you are not yet a Christian, I want to invite you this morning to surrender your life to this shepherd king, that he might secure your place at the table with his Father as a son or daughter. And if you won't do that right now, then I want to ask, why not? Why would you not surrender your life to Jesus right now? Don't just consider Jesus as a man sees by outward appearance. See his heart. See his heart. Behold the King lay aside his robes of glory. See him ascend the cross for all who would surrender to him in faith. The Lord is my shepherd.